Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The images out of Gaza have shocked the world. Entire neighborhoods flattened, tens of thousands of people dead, and growing evidence of war crimes. Yet the Israeli military campaign continues, backed by billions from the US in support and diplomatic cover. And the recent strikes on Iran have further raised the stakes in a region already on the brink. So is this impunity or empire in action? And if the US is a superpower in decline, as many have claimed, why does its military footprint still shape so much of our world? So tonight on the show, we'll ask, what sustains this structure of power? What role does the Global South have to play in challenging it? And what does resistance look like in this moment of global fracture? I'm delighted to tell you that my guest on the show today is historian and journalist Vijay Prashad. He's the Executive Director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and he's the Chief Correspondent for Globetrotter. He's also the author of The Withdrawal: Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of US Power, which he co-wrote with Noam Chomsky. Vijay, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. It's great to have you joining us. So let me begin this very important conversation that we're about to have by asking you about Gaza and the genocide happening there. What has that revealed to you about the current state of the international order, particularly in terms of power and impunity?
Well, firstly, I'm very happy to be with you, Melisa, and happy to have this conversation, firstly, with a person with your lovely energy. But I must say that this is a difficult matter to talk about. And it's difficult because it demonstrates a real decline of, what shall we say, humanist values, not just Enlightenment values, but the values of humanism. We're watching live streamed, as the United Nations put it, a genocide where one country, the most powerful military in the world, the United States, is just ceaselessly providing material, by which I mean large bombs, 500-pound bombs on a regular basis, to the Israeli military, which without much ability to take incoming fire is just bombing and devastating the lives of the people in Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza. And then on top of that, Melisa, what is heartbreaking is to watch the starvation politics. They've just stopped food, electricity, water from entering. Gaza already has the world's largest number of child amputees. That's stunning. It's just a population of 2 million. It's got the world's largest number, not per capita, of child amputees. And then now children are starving to death, in the dozens a day. This is just horrifying. And as I said, it demonstrates the absolute decline of humanist values. But more than that, it actually shows us that regardless of the changes, and I know you want to talk about that, the changes in world power, the United States still dominates. Military power is still able to intimidate other countries into silence. Even though countries around the world, people are exasperated, your country, my country, they've all complained and criticized this. I live in Santiago, Chile. It's the largest population of Palestinians outside the Middle East, 500,000 Palestinians. The government has complained, the Malaysian government has. It hasn't made an impact, and that is heartbreaking.
Right. So what does this moment tell you about the durability of US-Israel impunity? Is it likely to continue, even though much of the world is speaking out against it?
Well, it looks like that to me. I mean, this is a question really to ask the 191 maybe countries in the world, maybe less, because the Europeans seem to be entirely behind this genocide. I mean, the British are providing landing strips for Israeli planes. That was revealed very recently. The Germans are continuing to provide all kinds of support and so on. You know, it's very difficult to be pro-Palestinian in Europe. You get arrested for it. So the rest of the world, where are we? Why aren't we able to put pressure on the Israeli government to cease and desist? Why? Where is the talk, Melissa, of no-fly zones? When there was a minor civil war taking place in Libya, tens of people dead. The Europeans went nuts and said no-fly zone and so on, and then they went and destroyed the Libyan state. In 2011, NATO went in and just lethally crushed the institutions. Where is that noise? That's why I say this is the death of humanism. Where are our governments, the Asian governments, the African governments? Why aren't they running into the UN Security Council and saying no-fly zone? Why?
Right. Could I ask you that question? Why is there such a widening gap between people and power? Because we see such growing public outrage globally, and yet Western governments remain largely unmoved about the issue of Gaza. How would you explain it, Vijay?
Well, first, let's, in fact, give some praise to our governments. The other day, there was a music festival in Glastonbury, and Bob Vylan, a musician, made a statement which is not by itself objectionable. He said, look, I know my language, I know some Arabic and so on. And in these languages, it's very common to say, Murdabad, death to. You go out on a demonstration, you say, Melisa Zindabad, that is Melisa long live, and then you might say, whatever it is, some wretched political thing, or they say Murdabad, death to. It's a perfectly everyday expression in politics. Strikers say, this company Murdabad, whatever. In Arabic, it's the same. In many languages, it's the same. He says death to the IDF. The IDF is the Israeli Defense Force. It's a military. It's not to a people. He's saying stop the military. It's in my language, IDF Murdabad would be a perfectly normal thing to say in a protest. Perfectly normal. He says this. Okay. He gets attacked by everybody. The government of Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, puts out a tweet saying, Bob Vylan, you're welcome to come and play in Colombia. Just to give you a sense that our governments continue to be pretty forthright and straightforward and saying, we are not with this. Okay, fine. But then why can't you stop the Israelis? Why can't you prevent them from moving? Well, let's face some facts here, okay? Right now, the NATO countries had a meeting. They had the annual meeting in The Hague, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, led by the United States. They decided to lift their military spending to 5% of gross domestic product. They already accounted for about 70% of world military spending annually. Now at 5%, they're going to account for over 80% of world military spending. China accounts for around 4% of world military spending. These are major, dangerous military powers. Their ships patrol the waters off the coast of Malaysia, China, this, that, and the other. They have the capacity to inflict great harm on our countries. And therefore, they threaten us. They threaten us with two instruments: military, which they show they can use. They just used it against Iran again. They threaten us militarily, and they threaten us economically. You try to be too tough and, you putting on some new kinds of boots. We're going to prevent you from getting access to dollars. We're going to make the economy scream. You see, you can have capital controls. You can try your best to control, but you still need dollars to buy certain things and so on. De-dollarization hasn't happened. And so they can strangle you. You asked, well, why aren't we able to make them move? Because they remain powerful, even though there are shifts taking place in the world. These shifts are happening around trade, around development. They are not happening when it comes to the dollar's ubiquitous use or military power.
Talk to me about NATO and the expanding reach and its evolving role. It has, to a certain extent, evolved into the global enforcement arm of US interests. So talk to me about that and the role of the US military-industrial complex in sustaining global conflicts we see around the world. Is war good business for the US, and therefore the rest of the world will have to pay the cost for that?
What a good question, because, okay, look, I don't know what phone you have, and I don't want to ask you because I don't want you to publicly say it's easier to hack if you announce what kind of phone. But most people in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America don't have iPhones. They're just too expensive. Most of us have some Chinese phone or a knockoff phone or a phone made in South Korea or whatever. Yeah, that's what we have. We just can't afford to buy iPhones, most of us. Yeah, okay. So the United States is finding that its companies are not able to generate the kind of commodity sales that they used to. They don't have a lock on the market. Yeah, it's true that they have the lock on the market on some high-end things like high-end electronics and so on, but those just don't sell enough in quantity to sustain an economy. Where the US has a comparative advantage is in military sales. They are the world's largest exporter of military equipment. So it's true. Why Southeast Asian countries need to have a massive military, I don't know. Although it is true that in any day now, Burma could fall apart, and Myanmar falling apart could lead to a serious problem in South. But who is your enemy today? Who is Thailand worried about? Are they mainly worried about their own people, or are they worried about Malaysia, Cambodia? I mean, who are you? Why buy so much military? Well, one of the reasons is military purchases are the best way to make a lot of money through bribes. So government officials who are prone to bribery, build up the threats and so on, and they make a lot of money. There's a lot of money swashing around, in the swill, the pig swill, where the pigs eat. There's a lot of money sloshing around in the pig swill. Okay, that's true. And I get the point there. That is correct. But more than anything, it is also true that for the United States, diplomacy comes with a gun. We saw that decades ago. In fact, in the WikiLeaks materials, it was already clear that US diplomats were complaining to Washington, saying, listen, I'm just the stenographer of the general that comes to town. The general is making foreign policy. They walk in, they say X, Y, Z, and I just take notes and send it to you. This was in writing from the ambassador in Pakistan and the ambassador in Egypt. Now, this may not be in all embassies. These are quote unquote hotspots. Yeah, but still you get the vibe. And by the way, the US military has a field of study in its defense intellectual wing called military diplomacy, where they've actually theorized this. So military sales, which are so wasteful, trillions of dollars over the last 10 years, military sales, and we have people dying of hunger around the world. This death of humanism that I talked about earlier is a general condition. We seem to want to live in a culture of cruelty rather than a culture of humanity. That I can walk down the street in a civilized country and see somebody starving on the street, and that's completely acceptable. It's not a surprise to anybody. It's just a normal fate of life. Is a culture of cruelty. The fact that we can live in societies where there's such a large number of women who are killed every year by their spouses, and that just sort of goes by, is part of the normal culture of cruelty with which we live. So, you asked me a really good question, a specific question about arms sales. But really, the arms sales, the genocide, these are part of a much wider culture of cruelty, which breaks my heart.
But so the decline of humanist values, as you mentioned, Vijay, is that a new face of imperial warfare? Is that a way to, it's a new pattern of fighting wars, proxy wars without boots on the ground? Is this empire in another name?
Well, let's look at it this way, okay? We are intelligent people, and if I was to ask you that if you got into a taxi or got into your car and drove to the local university and sought out the most influential people in that university, yeah, who actually influence society, you would have a hard time finding them, because the intellectuals, the religious leaders are completely eclipsed by somebody else. Who are they eclipsed by? They are eclipsed by what is known in the United States as soft power. They are eclipsed by the music that comes from the US. They are eclipsed by, the fact that people in Asia are interested in what's happening in Hollywood, or people in Asia are interested in what's happening in New York. Wow, there's an election in New York. I mean, you don't know that there's an election in what happened to the opposition leader in Thailand, but you know that what's happening in New York, or you don't know what's happening in Bangladesh, but wow, in New York something, in London, there's this amazing new album out. You don't really care about who's the Malaysian great singers, or who are the Indonesian intellectuals going further afield, what's happening in Timor-Leste, who's written a book. These things are not there. So this so-called soft power has eroded our consciousness. You can't build a humanism in Asia that is going through New York. You have to ask yourself, what is the thinking? Why aren't you, or maybe you are, I don't mean to be insulting, but why aren't you, for instance, one of the key intellectual voices in the country, that sets the terms for thinking about what it means to be a human in the, let me say this to you. I on a regular basis meet young people on a regular basis. And what they are most worried about is, listen, they say to me, they sometimes call me prof, which I'm not, doctor, which I am, but not that kind of doctor, whatever. I just say, call me Vijay, and then they'll say, we are struggling to be good people. We don't know how to be good people. This is a very important question. It's a question that goes back to us, to the times of Buddhism, when the Buddha said, what does it mean to be good in the world? What is dharma? What is it to be good? These are fundamental questions for young people. They don't want to become money grubbing. They don't want to search jobs where it's all about money and they push people aside. They don't necessarily want to be celebrators of war. They want to be good people. And you know what? Where are the role models? Where are people articulating the theory of what it means to be good? It's not Elon Musk. He's not a good guy. It's not Jeff Bezos. There's a genocide going on, and you've spent tens of millions of dollars on a ridiculous wedding, all live streamed wedding with a live streamed genocide. Jeff Bezos, not a good person, in my opinion. Why are these oligarchs set up for us as role models? So that's what I would put back to you. It's not a question of this or that. It's a question of, let's start with the basics. The death of humanism is also the death of genuine leadership, cultural and sort of a broadly social leadership.
If we want to stop the decline of humanist values, we want to reverse the death of humanism, what would that look like? And I think of the word resistance because it's fighting and unlearning everything that's been pushed onto you and what you've been taught before. So if you were to think about what that looked like today, what resistance looks like today, not just on the streets in terms of protesting and the like, but across all our daily lives, across our consumption patterns as consumers, across media, across academia, across institutions, what might that look like to you, Vijay?
Yeah, it's again a tough question to answer in a few minutes. Obviously, I cut my teeth doing all those things you mentioned. Going out on the street and doing this and that. But in fact, it really isn't just about that. It's about thinking about what does it mean to make things in a society. If I go into a bazaar in say any city, Kuala Lumpur, or I go into a bazaar in Singapore, or wherever I go into a bazaar, why is it that I when I look at for toothpaste, for instance, everything is imported? Why is it imported? Why aren't we capable of making our own toothpaste? Every country doesn't have to make the toothpaste, for God's sake, but why does it have to come from China or Europe? Are we not capable of doing basic chemistry? Are we not capable of making our own soap? I mean, what strikes me as funny is once I was in Damascus in Syria, a city of very old civilization, great culinary tradition, and the biscuits available in the market all from Turkey. And I thought, wow, there was a time that Halab, which is Aleppo, the great city of Halab, which was like the center of cuisine. They with the Armenians that came there, understood how to cook meat with dried fruit, with figs, and with raisins and so on, drawing from Iranian traditions of like a biryani with dried fruit in it and whatnot. You can't make biscuits. Why are you importing your biscuits? You're asking me what is resistance? Resistance means learning to do things for yourself and not being, in fact, somebody else's pawn. Thinking for yourself, making for yourself, learning to teach your children how to make things. Not just to go out there and buy things. Consumerism isn't existence. Consumerism is not existence. To exist is to build things, to manufacture things, with ideas or real things. That's what living is. My kids, at birthday time, yeah, make me something. Don't buy me something. Make me something. Yeah, go learn how to be a potter, or my second daughter, made me Grogu out of, this is Grogu, yeah, from Mandalorian. Make me something, for God's sake, because when you make something, there is dignity in that. There is dignity in that. You are dignified. You're not just dependent on somebody else. The great Burkina Faso leader, Thomas Sankara, used to say, he who feeds you controls you. He who feeds you controls you. Learn to feed yourself. Why are you importing pasta? For God's sake, you're not Italians. Kids don't need to eat pasta every day, right? Eat whatever, rice with some delicious vegetables, stir fry. Children, learn how to cook. Don't just use processed food in a microwave. That's resistance. It sounds a little off from your question, but really what I mean is, if you learn to feed yourself, you will not be dependent on somebody else.
I liked what you said about learning to think for ourselves. And I think that as in this age of the 1,000-channel media at the moment, we are just consuming what we want and we're not really thinking. It's all kind of passive consumption. Given that, you've studied this, you're a historian, you're an author, you're a journalist. I'm wondering, if we were to apply this lens of thinking for ourselves, of thinking critically about what we're being fed, what would you highlight for us to pay attention to? Simply, people, particularly in the Global South, what should we be paying attention to now that's not maybe getting enough airtime, enough spotlight?
Well, a couple of things. One is formally, I'm really, really happy we're using the technology available to us to do things like this. Why? Because, see, you have your show. You're thinking for yourself. You're bringing in guests. You're having a conversation. This is very important. Yeah. It's important that there are all these young kids on the internet with their YouTube channels, and their podcasts, and this makes my heart swell, because it means that they are not just consuming media. They are all out there chatting, talk about whatever. I want to talk about Dua Lipa going on a world tour, because I had an experience recently that just I was it's a whole other thing. Okay. Not today, another day. Okay. So anyway, I'm really happy formally that all these things are happening. Yeah. But in terms of, what should one be talking about? I'm a little bit of a one-trick pony on this, because I obviously talk about whatever. Why should I tell you what to talk about? But, in our institute, in Tricontinental, we are really fixated on what we call the new development theory. And what we are asking people is, like, if you are a country of, 80 million people, 70 million people, what is the development pathway for your country? Because what's happened is, over the last 50, 60 years, we have become dependent on the International Monetary Fund to basically tell us what they think our development pathway should be. We are not building our own debate and discussion. What are the raw materials that we have? What are the people capacities that we have? What should be our pathways of advancement? How are we going to exit poverty? Does it make sense to build a train line to China and be part of the Belt and Road Initiative? Is it make sense for India and Southeast Asia to have a much closer relationship, a sea relationship? Is that make sense? There are language affinities in both directions. Some countries in Southeast Asia are very fortunate. There are Tamil populations. You can have a link with India. There are Chinese populations. You can have a link with China. These are very fortunate thing. How do you think holistically about the development capacities of a country, rather than saying, hey, listen, you've got to tighten your budget, you've got to stop funding education? I mean, this is a recipe that applies to everybody. So when you ask the question, as I said, with a one-trick pony, I'm obsessed with this, that every country needs to develop its own development pathway. But in fact, to be honest with you, it's not such a one-trick thing, because it really is asking people, hey, listen, build your own thing. I'm not going to tell you what it should look like, but I want to hear from you. Who are your great development pioneers, your thinkers, that you may want to go back to start there again and think, who are these people? There was an amazing guy in Singapore who was a man of the right, very different from my politics, but his name was Rajaratnam. And he was Lee Kuan Yew's foreign minister. The School of International Affairs is named after him in Singapore. He's a man of the right, okay. But very early on, and I wrote about him in Darker Nations, Rajaratnam said, look, we are a small island nation, basically. We need to develop our port, and that should be the center of our, we are going to become important because China is going to become important. And he thought in advance, and look what he did to this tiny island, and it's not just Rajaratnam. It's wrong to say it's him. He was leading a team of people who were studying this. But if I return to the source of Singaporean development theory, I would go and read about them. Every country needs its intellectuals to return to the source and try to go around the IMF period of dead thinking.
Vijay, it's been such a joy speaking with you. Thank you so much for that invigorating conversation. That was historian and journalist Vijay Prashad there, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.